Over to the Dáil, where proceedings are expected to get underway in the next few minutes. First of all, Deputy Harrington, there will presumably be a pall over proceedings this afternoon.
Yeah, deeply shocking news from Berkeley in California, and I suppose all we can say at this stage is our thoughts and our prayers go to the families of those who've lost their lives and those who've been seriously injured. We'll be thinking of those.
And leaving Berkeley aside, another story dominating the news agenda up until this tragedy was the story of Cleary's workers, and little by way of a golden handshake for them.
No, I think it's dreadful how the employees and the employees of the shareholders of Cleary's, those that had the shops inside in Cleary's, have been treated with such immediate effect. They were let go. I think that's appalling, and that needs to be addressed. But it's with the liquidator now, and I hope that those they will get their assets, their redundancies, and their stock from Cleary's as soon as possible.
Miall, politicians across the board very, very critical of how this has come to pass, the manner in which this has come to pass, but little consolation for those workers and those concession holders high and dry this afternoon.
Yeah, the Employment Minister, Ged Nash, speaking today and saying how the government was always eager to stay ahead of corporate liars. However, clearly here there is that question as to whether company law has gone ahead of employment law. Everything here seems to have been legal, but no less ruthless for that. I mean, the workers given very short notice, speaking at lunchtime, some of them trying to get on with their lives, not expecting to get any money for weeks now, and already trying to go to their social protection office to get something, but even there are difficulties and waits. So a particularly difficult one for government, I suppose, made all the more difficult by the fact that Labour have been highlighting for some time how they're strengthening employment law. It's a particularly important issue for that party, but yet something like this did happen and has happened, it seems. So
structures, Deputy Harrington, clearly need to change in order to ensure that something like this doesn't happen again.
Well, we've seen it happening before, and we have done quite a bit of work on employment legislation. But clearly when you have somebody as I suppose a brand like Cleary's going into liquidation, it's quite serious. It's taken everybody by surprise. And all we can do now is hope that they get their documents ready for claiming social protection, their redundancy, and for those that were shop owners within Cleary's, that they will get their stock from the building as soon as possible.
Perhaps this will crop up during leaders' questions. Let's cross over now to the Dáil. Thank you, Deputy.
The collapse in Berkeley, California. My heart breaks for the parents who have lost children this morning, and I can only imagine the fear in the hearts of other parents whose children in California this summer as they seek to contact them now. I want to give the Department of Foreign Affairs telephone line, which is 01 418 0200. 418 0200. It's with great sadness that I confirm that a number of young Irish citizens have lost their lives while a number of others have been seriously injured. It is truly terrible to have such a serious and sad incident take place at the beginning of a summer of adventure and opportunity for so many young people on J1 visas in the United States. The Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade at Concorla has opened its Consular Emergency Response Centre, and an experienced consular team stands ready.
The law, what needs to change in order to ensure that this doesn't happen again?
Well, I suppose the first thing is it's important to note that the Minister Richard Bruton introduced probably the single largest piece of legislation on company law over the last number of years through the Houses. It has revolutionised how companies are dealt with by law and by legislation, and has reduced bureaucracy in both establishing and running companies right throughout the country. That should indeed be reviewed in this context. But it's also important to note that you need to strike a balance. While Cleary's quite rightly is making the news today, there's many companies up and down the country, for example, people who are self-employed, who would not be in a position to get a P45, would not not be in a position to get social protection and would be left isolated on their own. And that's a balance that needs to be struck between
sure. But again, just to bring you back, Deputy Harrington, how does it happen that a company can, within the law, divvy up its entity into two different companies, one an operating store that is essentially insolvent and another a highly profitable property entity? And we heard a figure today, something in the order of 19 million pocketed, to use the word used by Gerry Adams, by this Boston-based group.
Yeah, I'm not familiar with how the companies, I believe one was the property based and one was the trading company, and that, I believe, happens, it's not alone in that, and there's an ethical issue to be addressed in how companies can subdivide or exist as two separate entities under the one roof, as it were.
So is that something that should be looked at by this company law review group then?
It may well form part of those terms, but I think it's important also to note that the liquidation process is before a judge in the High Court, I believe, and it's under the supervision of a judge and a judge-appointed liquidator. So, and if the judge or the court has any concerns on the report of the liquidator, it's important to note that that judge can seek further clarification on that. On the splitting of two companies, I think that's something that may well be looked at in the company law review that the Taoiseach did refer to.
OK, so that's something then, Micheál Lehane, that you expect might be looked at by this new group. And also these other provisions mentioned today during Leaders' Questions by Gerry Adams, enhancing the period of notice owing to workers, making that a legal requirement. That didn't happen in this case. And also penalties for those companies who breach this particular provision.
Yeah, and I think that point about the notice being so short seemed remarkable, that someone who had worked there for 40 years and he got half an hour's notice that the shop was shutting and his job was gone. That referred to a lot during Leaders' Questions today. And of course the symbolism couldn't be greater. Cleary's well known, and then the whole Jim Larkin connection with that shop. So it is a tricky one for government, and it's something that, will they be able to defend it by saying that the payments are being made very quickly and social protection is doing everything they can, or is there a breach, as some would say, in company law that allowed it to happen at all?
That figure of 19 millions referred to there by Gerry Adams, is that new to you?
I hadn't heard that figure before. Gerry Adams, the only one to put a figure on the record of the House there. But clearly the property was very valuable if the business wasn't itself, but the workers aren't able to get any of the money from that very valuable property.
Or indeed the concession holders, their own stock. Let's move on to that issue raised by Deputy Wallace there, the fire sale of distressed assets by NAMA. He's calling for an investigation. Yeah,
Mick Wallace making the point that NAMA sold a lot of properties in 2012 that are now worth a lot more. He spoke about one particular building on Mount Street, sold at the time for around 27-28 million, sold recently again, sold on by that company for more than 40 to 42 million. Again, clearly, did NAMA have to sell at the time, or could they have waited? He said they should have waited. That would have been for the greater benefit of the taxpayer. It would also... Again, we're looking back at that period through a very different prism now, aren't we? I mean, at the time it was... There was a sense that get as much as you can, as quickly as you can, and get the system rolling. He says, though, there is another consequence of that because of those properties were sold for less than, he says, and he is a former builder, less than the price of building them. Therefore, you have a crisis because builders are not encouraged to come back in building more houses in Dublin, even though there is a clear demand. So that a consequence you probably wouldn't think of straight off. Nonetheless, I think NAMA have always been clear that their job was to sell stock as quickly as they could. Whatever, Deputy Harrington, you say about an investigation into these so-called fire sales, it's pretty clear that the taxpayer did take a bit of a bath. Again, using those two examples quoted by Deputy Wallace, Mount Street sold at 27 million, turned around for 42 less than 2 years later. The Forum building, I think, in the IFSC, 28 million, turned around within 2 years for 37.8 million. They're small enough examples, but very, very stark.
Well, I think there's a few things to reflect on this. I think it's important to note that the NAMA makes up a part of a property market in this country that really it shouldn't be anywhere near it. And the sooner NAMA comes off the landscape, I think we'll come back to a more regular, normal property market. Those decisions taken to sell those properties are taken at a given time in a given context. And like any property, in most properties that I'm aware of in Dublin, those prices have risen. It's not the same in the rest of the country, and many people regret that and would like to see those prices in the regions increasing at that rate. But they are increasing in Dublin. Should the building ever be sold
below the cost of what would take to rebuild it? That's the question.
There are houses being sold up and down the length and breadth of the country at below the cost of rebuilding, and that's the sign of a dysfunctional property market. And that's why it's important that two things happened. The first is that NAMA would maximise the return to the taxpayer, and the second, they would essentially absent themselves from that market so that a normal functioning construction market would begin. It needs to begin not at the levels it was, nowhere near it, but it does need to increase its activity. Particularly in Dublin, you have an acute housing shortage which is leading to increase in rents and increasing in prices, and the examples by Deputy Wallace just reflect that.
Okay.
It's the market in Dublin.
Thank you very much, Deputy Harrington, for joining us on Leaders' Questions today. Also, thank you, our own Micheál Lehane.